Hello, fellow environmentalists, mindset changers, and conservationists. Today with me is William, an expert in insects, the flora and fauna. And William, glad to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. I really don't know where to start, so I'm going to leave the questions to you.
Okay, so William, tell us about yourself, your upbringing, where you went to school, and what you studied.
My father was born in Dola, so I was raised in Zambia despite my mother being British. And until I was 15, my father won the argument, so I was educated in Lusaka, and then my mother won after that, so I did my A-levels and my degree in the UK. And I did zoology, because as soon as I was sort of conscious of there being a wider world, it was the small things moving in it, so grasshoppers, beetles to an extent, flies, frogs and reptiles I adored, but grasshoppers in particular were really fantastic. And in the Nyombo, which covers most of Zambia, they are probably the second most important herbivores there are. We look at the big elephants, we look at the big zebras and worry about that. So when I finished my zoology and came back here, I really wanted to get more information available to everyone so everyone could learn about, I mean, it's a fantastic diversity. We all bring tourists here to look at elephants and zebras and giraffes, but the bulk of our diversity and the bulk of what's actually happening in the environment is six-legged and quite small.
Okay. So, I did mention flora and fauna.
Yep.
Those are quite big words, if you could.
Yeah, so flora is just very broadly, flora is plants, quite literally flora. Flora means flower, so any plant, any vegetation, they come on flora. Fauna is all animal life, and I know here a lot of people they think of animal, they think of something with a backbone, but that animal extends to crabs, fish, insects, even spiders and earthworms are animals, so fauna is just all animals. And so flora and fauna is animals and plants.
Okay.
But it's a slightly Latinized way of saying it. So zoology is specifically about the fauna. Okay. I did do a few modules on the plants because the alternative was to do more genetics, and as far as I'm concerned, Zambia does not really need genetics right now. It needs to know what's there before it starts looking at what their genes are doing. And so plant science was preferable. But yeah, zoology, the zoo part literally means animal, hence zoological park, or Mundawanga Zoo. Okay. Flora is plant.
Okay. So why are insects so important for our environment?
The first thing is that we are. We're inextricable from our environment. We think of ourselves as a single organism, first off, and we are actually, most of the cells in your body or my body are not, they don't have human tissue, they are bacteria. And we, in the environment, are more or less the same. We're a part of a much larger system, and that system survives because of the diversity. Okay. If we were to get rid of everything else and just be us, even if we could manufacture food in a lab, the system would become very chaotic, it would become very difficult for a single species to survive in it. The bulk of that diversity is insects. There are 1.4 million species, so different types of animal and plant and fungus and bacteria described on the planet. 1 million of those are insects. There are probably another 4 million that we haven't found yet. But it's a huge amount of diversity, and they're not just sitting in the environment passively. We know about pest insects, we know about slugs, not an insect, an invertebrate coming and eating our vegetables, we know about mosquitoes spreading malaria, but we forget that mosquitoes, when they're not spreading malaria, they're also pollinating a vast range of plants or flora, including some vegetables. Carpenter bees, which destroy the beans like we have here. I can find a carpenter bee if I'm... These little guys, so you see this little black and white female and the yellow male, they are the main pollinators of tomatoes in Zambia. Okay. We also get some pollination from hawk moths, but a honeybee, which everyone thinks of as your main pollinator, it can't actually stimulate the tomato flower properly. Okay. So you need a larger, sort of heavier body bee, such as these carpenter bees, and we think of them as a pest because they damage the structures of our houses, but without them, no tomatoes, and I think Zambia would be a very different place with no tomatoes. And it's that diversity of things pollinating that creates the diversity of vegetables we could have available. If it was just honeybees pollinating, a large number of fruits, a large number of vegetables, they'd never produce. Then you also have, well, the birds and the mammals that we eat. They rely on a healthy environment, and a large part of the healthy environment is different checks and balances. Birds need insects to eat directly, but insects, by damaging some plants more than others, they create a more diverse habitat, which means diseases don't then spread through all the plants. And so then you have a more stable habitat for your larger, more sort of sightly animals to live in, that we then depend on directly. I don't know if that's too in-depth or not in-depth now. Sorry.
It's just fine. Now, you mentioned that some insects do damage some crops, and we have 3/4 of the farmers that will get pesticides and will actually spray their gardens not knowing what importance some insects play. So how would you advise farmers on how to go about the spraying? And
the first thing most farmers in Zambia need to do is, if you start out not spraying, you're in a much better position. When we first started using pesticides on a sort of commercial scale, which I believe was in the 1920s or 30s in the US, for the first 2 years...
Okay, so you did mention that some insects do cause damage to the environment. Now we have a lot of farmers spraying insecticides, trying to kill mosquitoes, which I'm told are quite important for pollination. So what would you advise the farmer on?
So the first thing is pesticides. It's a little bit like antibiotics. We rely on them more than we should. If you were to take the best example, the very first time you had insecticides used on a commercial scale, this is farms in, as far as I know, the southern US in the 1920s and 30s. The first couple of years when they started spraying, they saw an increase because they were losing less to pests. Subsequently, they started finding out they were getting less harvest. And a large part of that, and I don't actually have pictures because I haven't done posters of the bugs yet, I'm sure farmers in Zambia will all have encountered the green stink bug. It is a very common, very widespread insect, and it is entirely a secondary pest in crops, particularly in beans, in soy. It moves in after its predators have been killed, and its predators I do have a picture of. One of the most important ones is something called a roe beetle. It's this little red and black character here, and this is a very generalist eater of insect eggs. And so what happens is, this is normally in the field, going around, quite happily eating away insect eggs. Most insect eggs are quite chemically resistant, and so you can douse them in, probably not methamil, but a lot of the pyrethroids, a lot of the organophosphate chemicals that are used in farms. If those were to be dumped on insect eggs, particularly stink bug eggs, the eggs would be fine. But these predators, as you see in the big national parks, lion, you don't see as many lions as you see in impala. The predators are always rare. And so you spray, you make the predators even rarer, the eggs survive better, they hatch better, and then you suddenly have an explosion of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these secondary pests. So the big thing is to try and focus, if you are having to use pesticides, to try and work out which insects are beneficial, which ones are harmful, find out whether something is eating your harmful insects before you spray, and when you do spray, target spray. Don't spray the whole field. So say, for example, you are suffering from, bullworm, for example. It's a very common pest. It's probably one of the most important pests in Africa. In fact, I believe it is the most economically damaging pest we have. But if you have that in your field, the first thing you want to check is whether you also have a lot of this wasp. So this is Niekerk. It's not a very good picture, sorry. It's a very long, thin, brown wasp. The most distinctive feature of it has a tiny little brown triangle on its otherwise perfectly glassy clear wings, and 3 large sort of blue-black secondary eyes on top of its head. All wasps have those, but they're very large and bluish black on Niekerk. And that is a parasite of bollworms. It's much more sensitive to any chemicals than they are. It's also rarer than they are. But an adult will lay its eggs in some 20, 30, 40, even, sometimes even sort of 60 different caterpillars. It'll reduce their health inside. It'll stabilize the population down. It won't drive them out completely, but it will mean that their damage is so much less because they are weaker, they're not reproducing so much. And that's actually a very good, that's how nature sort of stabilizes its populations. So caterpillar populations in the wild tend to be sort of down-regulated by parasites. The moths are overproducing because they're expecting a lot of those caterpillars not to survive the parent. It's like they really need 2 or 3 of their young to survive. They produce hundreds because they're expecting that most of those will be eaten. In a farm, you spray, you kill everything that's eating them, you suddenly have hundreds. So that's why it's much more important, rather than sort of spraying the whole field, to target spray. So it really does take more monitoring. But you see it on the commercial farms in particular. You see people who've gone and they thought, okay, I'm worried about, say, getting, again, bollworm in my maize. So I'm going to spray everything. And then they get a secondary pest, the maize aphid, which is not usually a problem. I'm sure most farmers who watch this will have seen a maize aphid, but they won't have lost a crop to it. But if you have a very large sort of a centre pivot field, which is entirely devoid of any predators of aphids, and you have 2 weeks without rain, those aphids are producing vast quantities of sugar, which then starts to rot the maize. It really damages the crop. And that's because they sprayed in case they got a pest, and they didn't target spray, they sprayed the whole field. And so it's much more important to be aware of every part of your field, not treating it as one big blanket. And when you have a pest problem that's not dealing with itself, if you're not finding your wasps, you're not finding the predators, then to go in with your spray, but just in the area where you're seeing a lot of pests, to give your predators a chance to move in to the rescue. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Now here we have a catalogue of grasshoppers.
Yes.
Grasshoppers usually have sensitive legs. Once you try to touch it, the leg comes off. Does it grow back?
So insects healing is very different from mammals. So they go through a number of sheds, and grasshoppers usually 6 between hatching out of the egg. They look like a tiny grasshopper, and then they slowly grow wings and become an adult grasshopper over a period of 6. Usually, it can vary a little bit. But in those very early stages, an injury can be healed more or less completely, because every time they shed their skin, they can recover the parts that have been lost. But usually an entire leg is beyond their capacity to grow back. Once an insect has wings, it doesn't shed its skin again, and it doesn't really heal. So any of the grasshoppers you see with the lovely long wings, so this is one of my favourites, this is the blubber locust. You can see most of its body is those wings. At that stage, it does not heal. It loses a leg, its leg is gone. It can sort of close the wound, but even that is not as efficient as you or I would. But they don't usually lose those legs defensively. If they're grabbed, the tendons holding those on are a lot weaker than in our body. It's almost as though rather than having a sort of tough skin holding everything together and the skeleton inside, they've got a tough skin with some weak tendons between them. But it's not fun to be an insect in terms of healing. Any injury is probably fatal. Any others?
Okay, so how long did it take you to catalogue all these insects? What types are there? I can see butterflies
so we've got, we've covered the grasshoppers briefly, and we've also covered, so I've got 3 posters of the grasshoppers. These are just Lusaka. There is a...
So all these here are just Lusaka?
All of these posters here are for the common species of Lusaka. And really, most of these pictures are taken from 2015 on to now, although the last time I actually produced a poster was 2018. So there are stink bug posters will be coming out soon, but they are about 4 years.
4 years.
About 4 years these, but the really time-consuming thing. I mean, we're very fortunate in Zambia to still have a fairly healthy insect population. It is declining, but not as sharply as in Europe. And so finding them isn't such a trouble. Identifying them, because it's 150 years of mess. We don't have, most people who have a book on insects will have a South African book or an East African book, very rarely anything Zambian. The Zambian ones that are available are very shallow depth. But yeah, we've got...
You do mention declining. Why are they declining? specific reason for that?
Insects globally are declining. It is a cause of concern because, as I mentioned earlier, all the systems depend on them. There are a number of general reasons why they're declining, but why it's happening now is difficult to pin down. It's more like we've taken away most of the habitats.
Okay.
We spray everything. Our homes, our gardens, and our farmland are sprayed. If you go to Europe, it's much more pronounced than in Zambia, but it's starting to happen over a lot of Africa. You have very few natural spaces left. The fact that the first place these declines were really quantified was in Germany. You had a 60% decline over, I think, 20 years.
Okay.
And Germany has some of the best protected wild spaces in Central Europe. And if you compare it to Britain, Italy, France, the protection from chemicals, the protection from damage is much, much better, and yet still it's crashing. And in Africa, it's not a pronounced, but I'm sure people can, for themselves, they can look at a windscreen test. If you were in a money bus in a car 20 years ago, especially at the beginning of the rainy season, that windscreen was very quickly becoming difficult to see through. Yes. Now, I drive from here to Livingston in a car that is not any more aerodynamic than 20 years ago. It is more than 20 years old, and my windscreen is clear. There might be one butterfly has flown into it the whole drive, and it's a very good indicator that the density is just dropping off, and that means the food for the birds is dropping off, the pollination of crops is dropping off. One of the great things about the African diversity is in Europe, fruit trees usually have to be planted in rows to get fully pollinated. Yeah. Here we still do that because we're following the European agriculture model, but realistically you could have your lemon trees 100 meters apart, separated by guavas, mangoes, any other trees you wanted, and the pollinators would still be moving through because we still have so many more in Europe. But it is dropping, and if we don't start to actually pay attention to it, it will mean we are in a European system where you end up with some things having to be hand pollinated, which is not ideal.
Not ideal at all. Okay. So, if people want to access these, how do they access them? Are they on sale?
So currently it's really directly. So coming up to me or messaging me and saying which ones they want to buy. The price at the moment is 80 kwacha per sheet, which is a bit steep, but it's to get them printed and laminated. Currently, it's set by set. It's not cheap, and so it's not a large amount of profit in that, especially as I live out of town and have to come in. So it has to be in person. Okay. So I don't know if I should tell you my contact details or you can book them with a video. Yeah, so if you just send me a WhatsApp on 0968406081, then we can arrange production of these and arrange time to meet so I can get them to you. But yeah, so it's 80 kwacha per sheet, and there are 17 currently. So you've got the grasshoppers, which we've mentioned a few times. Sorry, don't know if I need to hold those a little longer for you to see them properly. We've got bees, ants, and wasps here, which are basically a rule of thumb for the most useful insect. If it's a wasp, it's useful.
It is.
Because wasps are not only pollinators, as good in many cases as bees. Bees have the advantage of being furry, so they hold the pollen better. Okay. Wasps are also predators. So in your vegetable garden in particular, the paper wasps, the ones that we all try and spray if they come into our houses because they sting, they collect huge numbers of caterpillars, huge numbers of soft-bodied insects to feed to their young. Okay. So they're very useful. Then we've got beetles, which I told you, but I can't remember if it was being filmed at the time. Okay. Of those 1 million insect species, 600,000 are beetles. Wow. So they are incredibly diverse. There's only 5 posters on Zambian ones. There are a lot more beetles in Lusaka than this, but the vast majority you will find on these posters. Okay. And then we've got flies, which again are a much maligned group. And in fact, I'm going to, if you don't mind, briefly talk about mosquitoes.
No, please do.
Because I've only got 3 types of mosquito actually on this one. There's a lot more than this. Okay. In Lusaka, we very rarely find Anopheles. Okay. Anopheles are, not all of them, Anopheles gambiensis, which affects a lot of East Africa, which is the malarial mosquito, is not overly picky about the environments it will thrive in. But in Zambia, we tend to have more sensitive species. They will tolerate some degradation of the environment. What they don't like is when you get large areas of stagnant water, you get a type of mosquito called Culex, which actually, it's quite similar to this, it's not the same as this one. It's a nondescript brown mosquito. It's all over Lusaka. That's actually not on this poster, which is an oversight on my part. Okay. I apologise. That will be corrected the next time I produce these. but its larvae, although it's a biting mosquito, it doesn't spread diseases in Zambia. Outside of Zambia, it's known to spread yellow fever and dengue, but those are not diseases that are endemic to Zambia. In Zambia, it's not a disease spreader, but the larvae, wherever it occurs, are predatory. Whereas Anopheles basically swims around grazing on bacteria, Culex eats other mosquito larvae, and so it actually excludes Anopheles. So the reason most people who get malaria get it outside of Lusaka is because it's very, very hard to find Anopheles within Lusaka. So transmission is very low in Lusaka. The best mosquito, though, the best of all, is this one here. This is the elephant mosquito. Absolutely fantastic, because I told you, male mosquitoes don't bite.
They don't.
Elephant mosquitoes, males and females, don't bite. They're entirely pollinators, and the larvae are exclusively predatory on other mosquitoes. And just above it here, we have this little one sucking my blood here. This is the tiger mosquito, Aedes. That's a common little black and white one you find in your lawn, in your garden, everywhere. It can spread diseases, but again in Zambia, the diseases it can spread are not present. But in lab tests, they found a single larvae of the elephant mosquito was more effective in controlling a tank of tiger mosquito larvae than the commonly used chemical controls were. Because mosquitoes breed phenomenally fast, and chemical resistance is a product of breeding rate. The more children you have, the more likely one of them will survive. And the tiger mosquito has a wonderfully high reproductive rate. Wonderfully is a questionable word choice, but it is very good at developing resistance. Anopheles is quite good as well. Anopheles gambiensis in East Africa has shown chemical resistance to DDT, which most people know DDT is a very, very toxic pesticide. It's banned in most countries, including Zambia. We do have some that are more toxic, but they're not as long-lasting, so their chemical effect isn't as strongly felt. But it's a very powerful chemical, and Anopheles gambiensis is one of the insects which you can literally dip the larvae in it, throw it back in the water, and it'll swim on quite merrily. So they are tough. But then to have an insect which not only is the right size to seek them out in any little hidey hole they could get into, it breeds in the same locations, and it doesn't bite or spread diseases. So if you have large blue mosquitoes which show no interest in you whatsoever,
then it's the elephant?
Yes, the elephant mosquito, and you should be very happy with your garden.
Very good for the garden.
Yeah, also much more effective than the mosquito. You'll see little brown mosquito fish in a lot of the drains and ponds around Lusaka. They actually spend more time eating the predators of mosquitoes than they do eating mosquitoes, which means that they can be a little bit counterproductive sometimes. And then the last posts I've done is the butterflies, which are, you've got one on the white butterflies, so these include the very common ones you see in gardens. The black-veined white in particular is one that is everywhere in Zambia. There's a little distinction between butterflies and moths here, because on the next poster here we have the best group of butterflies. These are a very primitive group of butterflies, these are skipper butterflies, and most people would look at these and say, that's a moth. And some of them are even night flying, but it's their relationship that makes them butterflies, and also the flight pattern and the formation of their antennae. They have clubbed tip to the antenna, which the moths don't usually have. There's one group of moths do, but they're not common in Zambia. But they are, we have the Masasa trees, which dominate the Miombo woodlands. A major pollinator of them, but also probably the most important herbivore of a lot of them, is this butterfly, which would fit on my fingernail. So butterflies are not just pretty, they do also have massive ecological effects, because obviously browsing on the leaves of those trees, it opens up the canopy, it creates a space for a lot of things like the MIZU and a lot of fruiting trees to grow up beneath. And the trees need each other, but they also need a little less density sometimes. So that's the posters in general.
Okay, enough with the catalogues. We'll now be moving into the forest for a forest bath.
A little bit more of a natural environment.
Yes. Okay, so catch us in the forest as we explore the fauna.